There's yttrium, terbium, actinium, rubidium, boron, gadolinium, niobium, iridium, and strontium, and silicon, and silver, and samarium, and bismuth, bromine, lithium, beryllium, and barium.
If we do qualitative analysis, what that means is we're actually basically trying to figure out what's inside. So what's inside? And last couple of different types of videos covered qualitative analysis. So what's inside? For example, we try to figure out what kind of ions are inside. Whereas quantitative analysis talks about how much of it is inside. So quantitative, as in quantity, so is how much is inside, whereas qualitative is what actually is inside. In this video, we're going to talk about quantitative analysis. So that's called gravimetric analysis, is an example of that. And the reason why I mention all this is because the dot point itself says, identify data, plan and select equipment, and perform a first-time investigation to measure the sulfate content of a lawn fertilizer and explain the chemistry involved. Right, so first we have to measure the sulfate content, and we have to explain the chemistry involved as well. So this equipment would have been equipment that you would have used, or something similar to this equipment. You would have had your solid fertilizer, which in this case is ammonium sulfate, and the structure formula for ammonium sulfate is this. And obviously the sulfate is what we're trying to figure out, how much of that is inside. So this is what we're trying to measure. We have concentrated hydrochloric acid in a dropper bottle. We've got barium chloride solution, also in a sort of bottle. We also have an electronic balance, a hot plate, a glass rod to stir with, a watch glass, and a filter paper. The experiment would have had, you have different types of steps. First, what you do is you measure out your solid fertilizer. So roughly, let's say 1 gram. So we've got 1 gram of the solid fertilizer, ammonium sulfate. We've measured that out. So 1 gram. We measure that out using the balance. And we put that fertilizer, that solid fertilizer, into a test tube. Not a test tube, but a beaker, a 250 ml beaker. And after that, we add water in. And once we have the water in, we're going to stir to make sure it dissolves. Right? We want to make a solution, so we have water now. And then we're going to make sure we can stir. And with our glass rod, right? So glass rod to stir. And what that does, it dissolves the actual fertilizer. So now we've got a solution. Crystals have been dissolved. It's all in solution. The second step is to add hydrochloric acid. This just makes sure that if there's anything inside which isn't meant to be inside, we can try to help remove it. Right, so hydrochloric acid, about 10 drops. Third step is to take that solution and put it on a hot plate. So we're actually trying to actually boil it. So we're bringing that whole solution to a boil. And after we've brought it to a boil, what we're going to do is we're going to add our barium nitrate. Why would we add barium nitrate? Remember, barium and nitrate, barium and sulfate, when they come in contact, they form a insoluble salt, so they form a precipitate, which will be solid. So by adding barium nitrate, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make that barium, that sulfate, appear in the form of a precipitate. So once you've been adding the actual nitrate, what you're going to see happen, the barium nitrate, is you're going to see this precipitate forming. Now, once you've done it a couple of drops, you're going to bring it back to the boil. You're going to reheat it. And once it's back to boil, you're going to do the whole thing again. You're just going to add some more barium nitrate to make sure you get as much of that precipitation happening as possible. What you're going to do next is you're going to measure out filter paper and a clock glass, which is where you're going to put your filter paper onto. Just going to measure it out and note down the actual weight, right? So you're going to note down the weight after you've measured it out. The sixth step is sort of constructing a filter funnel using just your normal filter tunnel, which is this part here. It's going to be a tunnel. And you're going to have your filter paper on top. So this triangle looking thing is your filter paper. Once you've done that, you're going to pour your solution. You're going to pour your solution into that beaker. You're going to have your filtrate. You're going to have your filter filtering out all of the liquidy stuff, which is going to be called your filtrate. We don't really care about the filtrate in this experiment. We want to know what that precipitate is. And you're going to have your precipitate. It's going to be stuck in your filter paper. I'm going to draw them in these not the purplish dots, these gray dots, just so you can see them. Right, so our filter paper has filtered out the filtrate. We can get rid of our filtrate, and the good thing is that we have these different types of precipitate stuck in that filter paper. Next step is to take that filter paper and put it on our clock glass, our watch glass, and then put the whole thing into the oven. Why would we do that? Because there might still be some moisture, and what does the oven do? The oven dries. We don't want to have any water being in there because that would sort of change the weight, and we want to have only the precipitate being there, no moisture. So we're going to have the oven, we might leave it overnight. We're going to come back the next day, and what we're going to do is we're going to measure the whole thing. So we're going to measure the whole thing. So that's basically the steps in terms of your experiment that you might do, or something quite similar to this. And the reason why we do this is because now what we have is because you weighed the whole thing, so we weighed the watch glass and the filter paper without the precipitate, and you've weighed it with the precipitate. And let's say these are the results, then they don't have to be, but they might be. And through that, we can figure out how much the actual precipitate weighs. And how do we do that? Well, 10.8 gram is the weight with the precipitate, 10.2 gram is the weight without the precipitate. That means overall 0.6 grams is the weight of the precipitate. So the weight of the precipitate is 0.6 gram. That is the precipitate. Now remember, initially what we did is we added some ammonium sulfate into solution. That's the first step of the whole experiment. That means that the actual ammonium sulfate has dissolved. So we have these sulfur ions and these ammonium ions. And these ammonium ions aren't really important at all, which is why in the second step I'll leave them out. But then what we did afterwards, we added some barium chloride. Again, the chloride ions aren't important. But what's important is now that we have barium and sulfate inside the actual solution. And what that means is they come together to form that insoluble salt, which we then see as a precipitate. So the chemistry, it says explain the chemistry involved. We have barium ions, which are aqueous because they're dissolved in solution, and we have sulfate ions, which were present because we put ammonium sulfate initially into the solution. Both these are aqueous. When they come together, remember this table, sulfate here. This is the insoluble part of that table, and this means that sulfate is insoluble with barium, which means they come together to form a insoluble salt, which we can then see as a precipitate. So here's solid, as in it's a precipitate. That's what solid means in this case. So we can see it, and we can obviously remove it for the process that we just described. So we know that overall we have 0.6 grams of barium sulfate. That's what we know. But how can we, for example, figure out the percentage composition? So how much percent of those 0.6 grams come from sulfate? So we're trying to figure out how much of those 0.6 grams come from sulfate. What we can do is we can use our molecular mass. Remember, this is your normal different type of periodic table. What you have generally is you have these atomic masses right here. So this has 32 for sulfur. And you can use all that to figure out your actual molecular weight for each of these, right? So for example, we have barium, which if you look at the periodic table, you can find out it weighs 137 grams for 1 mole. Sulfur weighs 32 grams for 1 mole, and oxygen weighs 16 grams. So sulfate is SO4. I just did the calculations. All that together is 96. So 1 mole of sulfur weighs 96 grams, 1 mole of barium weighs 137 grams. So 1 mole of barium sulfate, if you add those two numbers together, weighs 233 grams. So we have 233 grams for the whole thing. That's what barium sulfate weighs. But we're trying to find out how much of that comes from sulfate. And we know that sulfate itself weighs 96 grams. So if we do the calculations, 96 divided by 233, we get a number of 0.41. So that means 0.41. If you times up 100, that means 41% of this 0.6 grams comes from sulfate. So if we do, again, we take the calculator, this is 41%. Now we're doing 41% times 0.6 times 0.6. So overall we have 0.247, or I can just round it up to 0.25 grams of sulfate in that solution. And if we wanted to figure out how many moles that would be, we can use the mole formula. N number of moles equals mass divided by molar mass. We know we have mass-wise, we have 0.25 grams of sulfate. We know the actual molecular mass is 96 grams. And if we put that in our calculator, so the actual mass divided by the molecular mass. That gets 0.0026. So that means we have 0.0026 moles of sulfur present. I'll quickly summarize. Again, this is just something that you can do as well. You can figure out the composition of sulfate and the moles of sulfate. But to sum up this dot point, we need to measure the sulfate content, which you've done with this experiment, right? You've done this experiment and you got the actual precipitate at the end. And the precipitate you could then measure because we know it's barium sulfate being the actual compound. And then we can figure out the molecular weight. And if we figure out the molecular weight, we can figure out the composition, the percentage composition. And thereby we can figure out how much weight comes from the actual sulfate. In this case, 0.25 grams with our calculations. And explain the chemistry involved, the other part. We have barium ions and sulfate ions coming together to form barium sulfate, which is a solid precipitate. And a solid precipitate, in this case, weighs 0.6 grams. And again, we can use that information to calculate the rest. I hope that was useful.
Thank you for watching.